I'm Gordon Raquel from Filmmaker U. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify your existing skill set. You can learn more at filmmakeru.com or follow us on Twitter at filmmaker_U. Every week, we interview film professionals to discuss their work, and this is made possible by our sponsors, OWC. Go to owcdigital.com for all your filmmaking and computer needs. This week, I'm joined by composer Nathan Halpern, whose work includes Swallow, Minding the Gap, The Rider, In the Same Breath, among many, many other projects. Welcome to the show, Nathan.
Thanks so much. Good talking to you.
Yeah. So I guess, we were just before we got into this, you were talking about doing narratives versus docs and the differences between that. From a composing standpoint, what are some of the differences that people should be made aware of?
It's an interesting thing, and particularly as the form develops in documentary and and in narrative and certainly in a miniseries and television too. This is something that's evolving all the time. For me, in many respects, while there can be differences, in many respects, my concerns between the two forms are kind of often the same in terms of what I'm trying to do. One thing in both forms that I think a lot about is point of view, right? Having the music be authentic to the point of view of our sort of protagonist or protagonists and in our sort of main characters, and to identify the kind of the sort of the true and authentic subtexts of a particular scene or of the film and have the music speak to them. And I feel that that's equally important in both fiction and nonfiction films. So that's something that comes up quite a lot. And I also find that, in both, there's this sort of broader question of identifying the aesthetic of the film. Like, what is the tone of the film? What kind of experience are we having in this movie? How are we to take this material? Is this a more kind of realistic verite kind of thing, or is it a more heightened kind of experience? I've been very fortunate in that most of the filmmakers who have sought me out and who I've collaborated with and who have commissioned me for a score are often people who are really looking for the score to do something, particularly say like for these documentary films, as we say, to do something which is cinematic in the sort of classic sense and heightened and is going to sort of elevate the story in some way. Now, this doesn't have to mean in every case where it's not appropriate, that doesn't always have to mean something that's grandiose and breaks the fourth wall and makes a huge, and you have big melodies, and sometimes that's appropriate. But even in the case of something which may have a more unconventional structure in a documentary or something like that, something that's very important to me, even in a doc form, is to find ways in which to create a thematic structure for the music. So even if it may be a big melody, it may be something that's very subtle or textural, but to still sort of plant certain motifs in a very deliberate way throughout the film to sort of enhance the sense of dramatic unity. And to really kind of bring everything together. So one way in which that can come up in docs is that, some of the documentaries that I've scored, like Rich Hill or Minding the Gap, will be films that might be a multi-protagonist story, right? And one might think, oh, well, thematically, that means, we have different themes for different characters in this sort of like Wagnerian leitmotif sense. But in fact, in those cases, you still are having a thematic structure, but what I've found is really effective there is to have shared themes. So rather than identifying people by character, you're creating emotional themes, which might get sort of passed back and forth between the characters. And I find that can sort of enhance the cumulative emotional weight of the film by the end, and to really help draw everything together in a way that's, more satisfactory emotionally, that will encourage the audience to reflect on different ideas in the film without telling them what to think per se, and to enhance the overall aesthetic and dramatic unity of the piece.
How do you, because there's so much you can hear how much goes into your process here, right? Like thinking about the different themes and so how do you approach a film when you get your first cut to see it, especially since a lot of editors will put in temp score or put in something that they think works, and then you want to bring your own stamp to it, not just
Yeah.
recreate. So how do you tackle that situation and creating a new sound?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. And I should say, in many respects, many projects are different. And I could talk about a number of ways in which these things all played out completely differently as far as process goes. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But one thing I will say is, like, no matter how you get there, by the end of the process, it can be something that was more planned out from the beginning. It can be a little bit more exploratory and chaotic, but by the end of the process, it should all really gel together in a very structured way. And there's different ways to get there. So, you know, a big part of your question there, as far as so much has to do with logistics as to at what point do you get involved in the project. So there are some projects that I've been involved with on one side of things from very early on, before, you know, while people were still filming, and I might have written a couple of exploratory pieces. There was an HBO film I did about Marina Abramovich. While this was being shot, I wrote some pieces that later that I wrote and recorded just as an exercise for myself. I shared them with the team and I forgot about them. And later, when the film started coming together, those pieces were already being used sort of as temp score and became part of the thematic backbone of the film. That's on the one side of things. And then very often on the other hand, you know, particularly with these sort of Sundance schedules that can happen, which can be very crazy, and you might get a lot cut of the film and have a very limited amount of time to do it. And in those cases, it's just, you know, it's getting right into it. I think in many cases, I might tend to, just as in an exploratory sense, dive into something maybe sort of in the middle of the film, and sort of, as I say, going to the structural point, start planting your flag. So if we find, for this kind of situation, for this character, for this kind of moment, this sound, this feeling, we feel sort of intuitively this is good, and then we might sort of plant that flag and place it. And now retroactively, we might then you know, build out from there and use those ideas in other parts of the film. But I think a very important thing for me, you know, particularly in some of the more psychological films that I work in, like the film Swallow, which you mentioned, I would say for me, there's kind of two parts of the creative process, and it's a sort of a left brain, right brain kind of duality. One is the sort of very analytical part where we're really speaking with the director in great detail, not so much about the music per se, but about the character's emotional state and the subtext of the scene and what's happening here and their point of view, right? And really getting a sense of that and how this, you know, particular scene or moment kind of fits in with the bigger picture of the film. And really kind of talking about that and thinking about that a lot, not in musical terms, just in general terms. And there's that. And then when sitting down to then compose for that, taking those ideas and kind of putting them, let them sort of percolate in the unconscious, you know, and then compose the music with that sort of guiding from behind. And then that composition process would be much more intuitive, touchy-feely, kind of dreamlike, like not sitting there making a sort of direct translation, but it's sort of guiding from someplace, and that's what's motivating the composition of the music. And that process, I think, is one of, as a composer and a musician, one of the great blessings of getting these film score commissions, which is that for me, the composition of a piece of music, the thing it really comes down to is inspiration. Like, it's not an academic exercise. Something needs to be sort of guiding your feelings, and that's what sort of drives it, right? This is why we have this, you know, tradition of all these great, you know, love songs and heartbreak songs. Like, someone had to write these songs, right? It was not some theoretical thing. And with a great sort of beauty of the commission for the film score is that this inspiration is being given to you, you know, in the form of this piece of work. And I think that I've always responded very emotionally and particularly through music to films. I think since I was a kid or a teenager, I remember being like 15 and watching Rosemary's Baby and then staying up all night, recording music and songs sort of inspired by this, sort of impressionistically inspired by this experience, and so that's, just a really wonderful thing about this process.
What you mentioned swallows. So
Yeah.
were you, I think about horror films and psychological thrillers have such a history of classic scores. Like there's so many that just you can think of, that sort of put people on edge. So were you excited when you got to do the psychological thriller Swallow?
I was very excited about that. And I think one of the reasons I was particularly excited about it was that, on the one hand, this was a film that was going to be very intentionally and very explicitly in its style and in its visual references and in costumes and everything, specifically referencing this sort of Hitchcockian De Palma kind of period feeling in the psychological thriller.
Yeah,
it was going to be. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say. So I was going to ask you how you approached it once you got sort of excited about it.
Well, I think one of the things about that was that I knew that was going to be one side of it, but conversely, it was also very clear for the sort of, for the director, Carlo Mirabella Davis, and the producers Molly Asher and Minette Louie, that this was also not just going to be a pure genre exercise, right? Like on the one hand, we were going to be referencing some aspect of that, but at the same time, the fundamental thing was to really use all of the mechanics of cinema, including the music, to get into this character, to take us into the psychology of a character that we might not understand, and to sort of engender empathy for her, for somebody who is doing something which most of us could not identify with, the desire to swallow dangerous objects. Most of us have not had that experience. How do you go into someone's psychology there? So in other words, that this was going to be presented in this heightened sort of genre way, at least in part. We were going to reference that, but not completely. So, I think it was an exciting thing to do. I think in that context, a big thing, of course, is that I knew that for some part of the palette, we were going to use a very classic kind of palette that we were going to employ, especially in the first part of the film. Some kind of silky strings. We're going to have piano and harp and this kind of stuff, and we were going to use that. And then over the course of the film, once we've sort of established that, as she's the lead character in this film is this is in this kind of been put in this sort of housewife role. It almost has this period quality to it, even though it's in the modern day. There's this facade to her life, and gradually this all starts to crack and crumble as sort of the truth is revealed. So over the course of the film, something that Carlo and I discussed from very early on is that this sort of facade of the music, which at first seems somewhat elegant and classicist, becomes sort of defamiliarized and starts to crack, and the string sounds start to get kind of gnarlier, and sort of weird discordant sounds start to cut in and cut against these kind of more classical sounds that seem to be coming from some other place. We used sort of odds, she swallows at various times sort of glass objects and metallic objects. And so we have these sort of pitched sounds from sort of metallic and glass sources that start to like emerge out of the music. And so earlier on, the music is quite melodic. And by the end, as the movie goes on, it becomes quite, that melody all falls away, and it becomes quite, atonal and dark and kind of falling apart in that way. So I think.
Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, so in that, a thing that was very special about that film and the creation of that score, we're talking about these thematic structures. One thing that was very unique about this film, as far as the things that I've worked on, is that there's an evolution in cinematic style over the course of the film. It begins in a more sort of mannered again, slightly period form. And by the end of it, the camera is kind of handheld. The performance style has slowly evolved. You start with this more Hitchcockian feel, and by the end of it, there's this almost like Cassavetes kind of feel.
Mm-hmm.
And this is in the performance, it's in the camera work by Kate Arizmendi. It's a really interesting thing. So the music needs to sort of honor that development and kind of track it in a way that makes sense. That isn't like, wait, where did that come from? You need to kind of set everything up properly and let it sort of gradually evolve. So that was a very exciting, very fun challenge as far as the score went, and that we really enjoyed.
Well, it's interesting because it sounds like you're pulling inspiration from so many different areas. Like you're talking about the metal sound.
Yeah.
You're talking about, Cassavetes, you're talking about Hitchcock. So when you're looking for inspiration or looking, to be sort of moved creatively, what do you do? Where do you go to find this inspiration, or what do you listen to, or do you go to the art galleries? How do you build that sort of, I guess, well of background knowledge?
I think, certainly all of the above. Certainly all of everything that you mentioned is all quite important to me. I think, besides the things that we have talked about, I think a thing that is often a real key for me is in literature, is in philosophy, psychology, and in particular, sort of like the psychoanalytic literature is something I was always very interested in. Freud and Lacan and Jung a little bit more recently. I didn't used to be so into that, but I have a greater appreciation for that now. And I think that, and also certainly like psychological novels, like particularly I feel like stuff that one thinks about a lot in the context of film, for me might be like, things like Patricia Highsmith and Dostoevsky and things that, the sort of great psychological novels.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, I think many of the projects that I might work on, particularly when we're dealing with something with interiority, having some of those kinds of framings and ideas is often really informative for me, and in terms of kind of finding a way into the material. And putting it in that context.
Now, the film, the writer, and also Minding the Gap were listed as two of Obama's favorite films,
yes,
or best films in 2018. What was it like when you saw that announcement?
Oh, it was great. It was so wonderful. I just, that just that he was watching these films, honestly, like that was so special and wonderful. And I think also too, I think of, Obama's a great writer. And I think of him as this very literary guy. And, certainly the idea that he would be very up on all of the latest, sort of history books and novels and things like that I would assume. Right. But so him with the cinema, I was not really aware of that kind of side of him. So that was really very exciting. Great to see.
For, we have a lot of young people coming, watching this series and who want to get into film. Was there something that you didn't know when you started your career that you wish you had known that young people should know about?
Well, I'll say, and I think, this is something that continues to develop. I think for me, and this is perhaps not uncommon, at least historically, as I've now learned with film composers, many of us, particularly certainly for myself, this was something that evolved, that I sort of fell into in a lot of ways. I was playing a lot of music and was very passionate about film, and here in New York, spending a lot of time at Film Forum and Anthology film archives. And playing music, and these two things sort of wound up coming together a little bit later. So I was not, say as a teenager, dreaming of like working in film, you know what I mean? It sort of came together in a more organic way a little bit later on. And I think this is not uncommon for at least historically, for people doing film composing. In retrospect, to my friends, it seemed obvious that this is something that I would be spending a lot of time doing, but it didn't occur to me until a little bit later. I wasn't thinking about it as a teen or whatever. I would say that the continued, if we're talking about composing, that the continued sort of cultivation of one's own music and one's own voice is very important. I would also say, and this goes back to your question before about outside sources of inspiration. Yeah. I think for everybody working in film, it can be tempting, I think, for a lot of people to focus purely on these sort of mechanical matters and sort of the mechanics of filmmaking and just studying films, or composers just studying music. But, the composers, it's important not only to be very engaged in cinema, but as you say, also in literature. And they should all have, subscriptions to the New York Times and the Economist, and really have a real understanding of life and of the world. I think that certainly I feel some of the best filmmakers certainly have some of that grounding. Like if it's just in the kind of pure film nerd world, some great stuff can come out of that. But I think the richest, filmmakers and creators and artists, have a bit more sort of grounding in life. And I think it's important for people to, make sure to have some experiences and, and kind of learn about the world. And that's really what's going to inform your work, right? Like you're doing this work to express something, and as a way to kind of process your life. So, it's important to have one in order to do that and not be too kind of insular in that way. So I think that's quite important.
Now I have one last question that I ask everyone we interview.
Yeah.
We've been stuck in this pandemic for going on 2 years now. And in that time, a lot of people have been stuck at home for quarantine or various reasons. Is there a show or a movie you discovered over the last year and a half that you think people should check out?
So I should say first, in the sort of quarantine period, I did not watch a huge amount of stuff because I had a lot of scores to do and a lot of work to do. And also I have small children and they were at home. So there was actually, I think I had less time to watch stuff than usual. A lot of the screening of stuff, I have to say, was a bit of kind of rewatches of stuff. I would recommend that everyone get the Criterion channel collection. Yeah. There's so much great stuff there, probably still in there. One thing that we did do is do a little Fassbender miniseries retrospective, and that's always in the collection. I'm not sure how much of it is always streaming at all times, but at least until recently, a lot of his work is streaming, and that stuff is so essential and it's so great. And that was stuff that I hadn't watched in a while, and we had a really good time with that. So definitely Criterion for anything, and particularly some Fassbender in there, I would recommend.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for letting us interview you today. And
thank you.
That's it for this week. Make sure to check out filmmakeru.com for all our latest courses. And of course, follow us on Twitter at Filmmaker_U. And again, I want to thank you for joining us. And of course, our sponsors, OWC. Go to owcdigital.com for all your filmmaking and computer needs. I'm Gordon Burkell. Thanks for watching.